Welcome everyone. This is the fourth meeting of the Mead evaluation class, and in this time we will discuss the evaluating Mead, doing a complete evaluation of Mead, and the BJCP score sheet for Mead and how to fill it, and what do we do in mead competitions? How do we judge mead in competitions and stuff like that? So this is the fourth meeting, as I said. It was rescheduled, but we're finally having it. The next time we will talk about mead flavors and troubleshooting mead, and that will be the final meeting of this course. This is today's presentation's outline. We will start discussing about mead evaluation, about the aromatics, the appearance, the flavor, and the mouthfeel of mead, and what questions should you ask yourself as mead judges. After that, we will discuss the basic mechanics of mead judging, getting ready for a flight, and judging a single entry. And then we will move to preparing score sheets at competitions, thought about mead judging, and that will be all. Okay, I've muted everyone. Okay, and that will be all. Okay, so we'll start with evaluating mead. We will start, so what is evaluation? Evaluation, as we discussed in the first meeting, if you remember, evaluation is a systematic, structured assessment of something or a determination of merit, worth, or significance against a set of standards. So in the BJCP, the evaluation process focuses on capturing accurate sensory perceptions, and then we compare them to the style guidelines and evaluate the mead. For the more recreational level at home, you usually do only the sensory assessment without the actual comparing to the style guidelines. So in the first meeting, we also discussed this slide. So this is the structure of a whole and complete mead assessment, okay, mead evaluation. So you have mead at the top, and then it splits up into appearance, bouquet, flavor, and overall impression. And in each one of these categories, you have to you have to comment on everything else inside of this category, like the color, the clarity, the legs, the carbonation and appearance, and so on for the rest of the categories. So we'll start talking about mead aromatics. How do we assess these? So the first thing we need to discuss is the aroma versus bouquet conundrum. So in the wine tasting world, they differentiate between aroma and bouquet. Aroma is only the smell of grapes, but bouquet is the complete smell of the wine. So for mead, aroma will be only the smell of the honey, and bouquet will be the complete smell of the mead, which means the honey, including the fermentation and any additional processes done to this mead. If you want to describe the total experience in the wine world, we use the term nose, okay? And it refers to the aroma and bouquet. So when we're discussing mead, we will use aroma in the beer sense, not in the wine sense, even though mead is closer to wine than beer. So we will use aroma. But usually when you use bouquet, it specifically includes the fermentation and age-related character of the mead. So we will start with assessing the mead aromatics. So to assess the mead aroma, You will swirl the mead in the glass and tilt it towards you. The first thing to do is inhale deep in the glass near the surface of the mead, but be careful not to dip your nose in it. We're not judging nose feel. Then we'll swirl again. We'll stop swirling and tilt and smell again, but this time we'll smell towards the upper side of the glass, far away from the mead. Then you repeat and smell in the middle using a series of short and quick sniffs. So remember to do all of these distances from the mead. It can reveal different aromas, and also do like your and okay. And finally, keep the glass leveled and smell a few inches above the glass, as we do with the beer. So we're looking to pick up on as many different aromas as we can find. And now we will talk about assessing the different aspects of the aromas of the mead. So first of all, we will discuss the honey character. Honey is to mead like grapes are to wine, malt is to beer, apples are to cider. It's the main flavor-giving ingredient. You cannot assess mead without describing the honey character, because it's the main sugar source, and which is turned into alcohol. So it means that most of the flavors and most of the insoluble parts of the mead usually come from honey. Okay, so the first thing, so you always need to assess the main ingredient. If you assess wine without discussing the grapes, or beer without talking about the malt, you will not have a complete assessment of the drink, of the beverage. So the first thing to note about the honey character is how strong or intense is it. The next thing would be, is it sweet? Usually honey is sweet, so does it smell sweet to you? Does it have a noticeable varietal honey character? If you know varietal honeys, okay, does it have something that you know and you can actually say, oh, this smells like this and this honey? So is it floral, herbal, fruity, spicy, or anything else? Remember, if you're in a competition or in an exam, try to give something more specific than these cluster names, okay, of descriptors. Next, describe the fermentation character. The next thing about a mead is basically honey with water and fermentation. So the next thing about you have to assess about the mead is the fermentation characteristics. Did the yeast add any aromatics? Are there any fermentation faults? If a certain type of yeast was mentioned, does it have a specific aroma? I don't know, like if someone decided to do a mead with Belgian beer yeast, does it have a specific phenolic aroma? Does it have an alcohol character? Mead is usually a high alcohol beverage, so it can have an alcohol character. So if it smells sharp or aggressive, it's a negative. But if it smells like spicy or smooth, it's a good thing in a high gravity mead, like in a sack mead. So next thing, characterize the overall fermentation character. Does it smell clean? Does it smell fresh? Is it dirty? Does it smell yeasty, sulfury, or anything else you can think about? After the fermentation character, move on to any special ingredients that were added to the mead. Were they used in the mead? If they were used in the mead and they were declared, do you detect their presence? Any declared special ingredients should be noticeable, but balanced in harmony with the other ingredients in the mead. If they're not balanced, then they did not add anything good to the mead and they shouldn't be there. Next thing about the mead is the balancing effects of the honey. Okay, the honey brings sweetness, which is converted into alcohol, but it has some residual sweetness. So the thing that is the balancing effect of the sweetness is the acidity. So acidity can be sensed in the aroma, but usually we do not smell acid. Okay, we cannot smell acid, but usually we smell compounds that are associated with acid in our brains. Okay, and then we say, okay, it smells acidic. So acidity that comes from fruit and yeast will be more readily detected in the aroma than those made with an acid blend that's added after fermentation. After acidity, please try to detect any special processing. So if any special processing were made and declared for the mead, do you detect their presence? Oaking will impart a woody, toasty, and vanilla character. Icing to create an ice mead will concentrate the aromatics. Intentional oxidation, like in Polish meads, will obviously introduce oxidation character. And then the last things to note are the balance, the harmony, and the pleasantness. Do all of the ingredients that you mentioned above complement each other? Are they in balance for the style and the declared attributes of the mead? And what is the overall impression of the mead aroma? Is it complex and nice, or is it dirty and harsh and not pleasant? And the other side of the scale. And obviously everything in the middle. So now I want to discuss with you one topic that's usually overlooked, which is flavor organization methods or descriptor organization methods, actually. So there are several types of organizing flavors, and usually all of these start with some clusters, okay, like we see in the wine aroma wheel on the left side. So we have the inner circle, which has clusters, okay? So you can see in the middle, you have fruity, and then fruity is broken down into more clusters and then into definitive flavors. And you can see that there are all of these flavor maps that are also built in the same manner. You have a cluster, and then every cluster is broken down into more descriptors. We can see a zoom in of the herbaceous or vegetative part of the wine aroma wheel. So you can see in the middle, we have the herbaceous or vegetative, and then it's broken down into fresh or canned or cooked, and then dried. And then you have the most specific descriptors on the outer circle, which are cut green beans, grass and fresh, bell peppers, eucalyptus, and mint. All of these are specific fresh, herbaceous, or vegetative descriptors. So always, especially in BJCP exams, always try to write with the most specific descriptors. Yeah, and I can tell you that as a proctor, usually when if I'm not detecting like anything that's very, very, very distinctive descriptor, then I will usually try and use the clusters, so that if you give anything within the fresh or canned cooked clusters, you will get more perceptive points. That's a tip for any BJCP exam. So this is about the descriptor hierarchy. Usually for mead, we use the wine aroma wheel. It's a very, very handy flavor organization method for any BJCP judge. Personally, I don't have the beer flavor maps yet, so maybe they are, but I have very good experience with the wine aroma wheel. Okay, so after assessing the mead aromatics, we move on to assessing the mead appearance. So to assess the appearance, we start with the mead color. So first of all, let's talk about the hue or the shade of the mead. So it can range between nearly water white all the way up to dark brown. See that the difference between hue and a color is that a hue is a color with an actual shade to it. So common descriptors for mead can be water white, straw. Yellow as a color, it's not a good descriptor, okay? But gold is yellow with intensity and stuff like that. Amber, copper, brown, common adjectives. So you try to add an adjective, okay, to the shade. So you can use light, pale, medium, dark, deep, inky, or whatever you like. Melamels can be pink, salmon, orange, red, ruby, crimson, purple, and brick, depending on the type of fruit that was added. Saturation or intensity, then note the saturation or intensity, which is the depth of the color of the mead. So it describes the lightness or darkness of the shade. So for example, scarlet is saturated while pink is not. Common adjectives will be deep and inky for high and light for the low section of it. After the mead color, we move on to discuss the mead purity, which is a different name for clarity. So this describes this is described as the correct, as being correct for its age, showing no water edge. So if you tilt the mead glass and you see a meniscus like in wine, it means that the mead is probably past its prime, and usually with no oxidation. The color of the meniscus is usually indicative of concentration, maturity, and richness of the mead. If you see that the mead is starting to settle too much, then it means that it's past its prime. The more color variation you will have, like the more from water to full color you will have in the edge of the mead. On the glass, it means that the mead is older, and evenly colored meniscus usually are indicative of a younger mead, and intense color can indicate a greater saturation, while dulled colors can indicate a lot of oxidation. Next, after you note the clarity of the mead, try and note its reflectance. Describe if it has like a mirror effect, okay, in the appearance. If you look from above, if it has a mirror effect. So if the surface is dull, then it can have it can be a problem with finings or filterings, or even oxidation or spoilage. Okay, so this is about the clarity and reflectance. I'm sorry, this was about the purity, and then the clarity. So the clarity is also a part of the purity, and it describes the ability of the mead to transmit, absorb, or reflect light. So it's often it's a measure of the mead's health. If you have spoilage or yeast in suspension, then you'll have less clarity. Descriptors can be brilliant, bright, clear, dull, hazy, cloudy, turbid, or even opaque. And the last thing about the mead appearance is the legs. It gives you an indication of the body, the alcohol level, and the sweetness. And you do that by swirling the mead in the glass and then looking for the arches that appear when the mead slides down in the glass. The wine judges usually call these tiers or arches. They have lots of names. After the clarity and the color, we move on to the carbonation of the mead. So not all meads are carbonated, but if you're told that this mead is carbonated, you should comment on things that relate to carbonation. So start with the height of the head, the quantity of it, bubble formation, the rate. Do they form rapidly? Do they form slowly? The duration of the persistence of the head. Usually you would not have such a good persistence with mead. It would usually be like a champagne with a quick dissipating head. The bubble sizes, are they big bubbles? Are there small bubbles? Usually small bubbles indicate better quality CO2 injection process. Did the bubbles form a head or a cordon? A cordon is this bubble ring around the rim of the glass. Are there bubbles on the bottom of the glass, and do they rise? And after all, characterize the whole the carbonation as a whole, if it's still, if it's petulant, if it's sparkling, um, and compare it to what you were told about the mead. So that's for mead appearance. And now we can move on to assessing the mead flavor. Um, so there are 5 basic tastes: the sweet, the salty, bitter, acidic, and umami. We used to think about these tongue maps, but they are completely wrong. We have all the tastes all around in the tongue, but some places of our tongue are more prone to detect other flavors, but the basic taste, the tongue map is not true at all. So we first start with tasting the mead. So we take a small sip into the front of the mouth and we swish the tip of the tongue through it. We then take another sip and move the tongue side to side and swish it through your mouth. Then take a sip and let it rest on the top of your tongue to actually get the palate more acquainted with the mead. And then take another sip and aerate the mead by breathing over it. You can make a slight slurping sound. Okay, then take a sip and swallow, focusing on the aftertaste. And after swallowing, keep your mouth closed and exhale through your nose. Obviously, all the way through all of these sips, write down any characteristic that you find. So the same as with aroma, we have to characterize the honey flavors and the sweetness of the mead. As we said, the honey is the main flavor giving raw material. So we have to discuss the flavor it gives. So do you get a distinct, clean honey flavor, or is it muddy and indistinct? Is there a veritable honey character that you taste? Is it distinct and unmistakable, or rather generic? How well does the honey flavor blend in with the other flavors? How strong or intense is the honey flavor? And note all of these things, write them down in the flavor part of the score sheet. Then, how would you describe the honey character? Is it floral, fruity, spicy, herbal, or some other flavor? What is the level of the sweetness? Is it bone dry, dry, off dry, slightly sweet, moderately high sweet, sweet, very sweet, cloyingly sweet? Okay, you have a lot of options. Do not confuse the sweetness with the fruitiness or the honey flavor. Okay, sweetness is only a measure of residual sugar. Okay, so try and be distinctive between those two in the meat. Then we move on to measure the other structural elements and of the acidity and tannin. Structural elements meaning that they give more body to the mead. Okay, so acidity, I'm sorry, they balance the body of the mead. Acidity will lower the body, while tannin will give us more body and drying the sweetness. So both of these balance the honey flavor and the sweetness of the mead. Acidity is the tingle, the tartness, the zing, or the liveliness in the mead. And descriptors can be flat or flabby, which are not enough acid, meaning too sweet. Pleasant is balanced. Tart is acidity is forward. You taste more acidity than sweetness. Or sour or acidic, which is very high acidity. Low acidity can also be described as soft, plump, and smooth, while high acidity will be crisp, tangy, tingly, or mouth-watering. It makes your mouth actually water after you swallow the mead. And usually it's described in the balance when we compared it to sweetness. We'll discuss tannins in the mouthfeel, but tannins make the sweetness also seem drier, but instead of lowering the body, they will actually add body. Then we move on to discuss alcohol flavors and bitterness. So alcohol does have a taste, but it is usually sensed as a warming, which is a good thing to say about the alcohol, or burning, which is a bad thing to say about it if you note it at all. Higher alcohol levels can introduce some alcohol bitterness, and alcohol and bitterness can affect the overall balance. Okay, they can affect the sweetness. Also, if the alcohol brings bitterness, it clashes with the acidity that's coming from the honey, and then we can have like a harsh flavor. Okay, so if you note any alcohol and bitterness, you should note it if you detect it. And as with stronger beers and wines, the best meads are often have a sneaky quality to them, where you do not feel the alcohol. You don't feel it, and then it sneaks up on you and making you drunk. Then we need to discuss special ingredients and processes if they were declared in the mead, and these can introduce a whole realm of flavors. Some honeys and yeast can produce flavors that mimic those from fruit and spices. If there are special ingredients declared, then these should be noticeable and generally identifiable, but they always have to be very balanced and harmonious with the other ingredients. Then you should generally try to describe for everything, okay? Generally try to describe the strength of it, of any detected. So if you give a name, I don't know, like cinnamon or clove, or at least a general description, like we discussed with the cluster, like spicy. So give both of them an intensity: light, moderate light, medium light, strong, pronounced, and so on. The more descriptive you can be, the more information you're passing along, and then the entrant in the competition or in the exam, the graders can know how much, what you felt in this mead. Then we move on to discuss the aftertaste of the mead. So you can describe aftertaste with its length. So it can be short, medium, long, or memorable. And this is the time that it takes to the flavors of the aftertaste to dissipate. And then you can also add what kind of flavors do you get in the aftertaste? Do you get sweetness? Do you get acidity? Do you get, I don't know, like citrus flavors if the mead was made from citrus honey? Or if it's a melomel, do you get the fruit flavors at the end? Are the flavors at the end are different from the initial taste of the mead? Usually this happens with metheglins, where you can get this burn, like spice burn at the end, and usually with meads with spicy peppers and beers with spicy peppers, you usually feel that. Are the aftertaste are pleasant, or they're balanced, or maybe they're not. And also in the end, note that all of the taste perceptions can be influenced by the mouthfeel. So for example, alcohol enhances sweetness and also acidity, but it can mask a lot of odors by giving you the alcohol aroma. And it may cause a burning sensation. Astringency can have a rough and gritty character, but it can mask bitterness, okay? So we'll discuss these things in the mouthfeel section. After the aftertaste, you should also describe the overall balance of the mead. So balance is relative to the style, okay? And its attributes. So if you have a sweet, dry, I'm sorry, a sweet sack mead, okay, and you have I don't know, like a sweet and sack mead with carbonation, the balance shouldn't be the same, okay? It should be towards sweetness, but obviously the carbonation will affect the balance, okay? Balance does not mean that the flavors are in equal proportions or intensities. It means that a sweet mead will definitely have more sweetness than a dry mead, but both of them can be balanced. In a dry mead, it should have less sweetness, but it's balanced for the style. A sweet mead requires sufficient acidity and or tannin, or it will seem too sweet, okay, which will be out of balance. But also, if you have too much acidity or tannins, it's also not balanced. So balance describes how well the individual components complement each other in the intended style of the mead maker. And it could be balanced towards the sweetness, which is a good thing in a sweet mead, or balanced evenly in a semi-sweet, or balanced towards acid in a dry mead, for example. Identify if any components are too strong or too weak in the balance, and does any individual component overshadows the mead, even when taking the style into account, like if it's a cloying mead? Is there any component that is lacking, not enough alcohol in the sack mead? Are the special ingredients identifiable yet not overtly dominant? And remember that the best meads are not one-dimensional. They will have some interest in character outside of the honey. They do not all have to be complex, but dry, delicate, and restrained meads can also be wonderful, as usually as dry meads and traditionals, usually as traditional meads. And also, as we discussed the wine aroma wheel, there's also a wine flavor wheel, but it's never been too accepted in the wine community. So we're not going to talk about it more, but just know that it exists if you want some references for descriptors. Next, we'll move on to the last part of the assessing the mouthfeel. The mouthfeel describes all of the non-flavor sensations in your mouth when you taste something. It includes the tactile sensations, the textures, and the feelings associated with the drinking. Notice that in the mead score sheet, the flavor and the mouthfeel are noted in the same category, not as in the beer score sheet. So you have to compress a lot of info into these 6 lines, which is why I usually advise in an exam getting a ruler and having and drawing wider lines to actually be able to put all of the information in this section. So body is a measure of the relative viscosity of the mead. It's like the mead, the weight of the mead on your tongue. It's usually the first thing we notice about the mouthfeel. It ranges from light and thin to medium to heavily or to heavy or full. These are the normal ranges for the body, but the mead can have a lighter or heavier body as a fault. Like if you say it has a watery body is usually a fault, and very full body can be viscous, thick, syrupy, and these kind of descriptors. The perception of the body is influenced by alcohol and sweetness levels. Okay, so stronger and sweeter meads will seem to have a fuller body usually. Carbonation describes the level of dissolved carbon dioxide in the solution and can range from still, petulant, to sparkling. Not all meads are carbonated, but if you're carbonated, you should comment about it. So still, always remember, the still does not imply totally flat. It can have some light residual carbonation from the fermentation. Sparkling has a fairly wide range as well, with spumant being used for the highest levels of carbonation. It's like very highly carbonated champagne or Prosecco usually. High levels of carbonation could be described as effervescent, But if you want to say that it's bad, like it's too much carbonation, but in a bad way, then you can use fizzy or gassy. Bubbly and champagne-like are more positive terms when we talk about sparkling meats. Then we'll move on to the mouthfeel of the alcohol. So alcohol can be unnoticeable, but it can have a pleasantly warming sensation in sack meats. But it can also have a hot burn, like in problematic fermentation meats. So a smooth warming sensation is a positive in character in a stronger mead, but the hot, solvent, burning sensations are always a negative, okay, in a mead, like they are in beer. Higher alcohol generally is perceived by having increased body, more warmth, and perhaps a bit more bitterness than lower alcohol meads. Acidity in a mead might be noted in the mouthfeel section, particularly if it becomes sharp or puckering or tingly. And the well-balanced acidity is more commonly noted in the flavor. High levels of acidity might affect the mouthfeel in a generally negative way. Tannins, astringency, dryness, and puckering are common characteristics, particularly when tannins are overused. So note any of them, and remember that a pleasant balance might not be noted in the mouthfeel, but aggressive tannins should always be mentioned, and oaking in meads can introduce tannins in addition to the flavor elements. So if you have an oaked mead that they said that it's an oaked mead, that you can have tannins with the oak flavors, and not like if they don't say, then you should have only the tannins and less of the oak flavors. Tannins can be described as not astringent, smooth, soft, and velvety, which are like good levels of tannins and that provide dryness and structure to the mead. But when it gets to slightly rough, moderately astringent, rough, harsh, very harsh, coarse, tannic, or highly astringent, these are the less good amounts of tannin in the meats, and also note that. So this is about the tannins, and this is where we end the part of how to evaluate mead. And now we'll have short discussions of the basic mechanics of mead judging, how to get ready for a flight, judging a single entry, and so we'll start with that. So mead judging is slightly different from mead evaluation, in that it's a structured evaluation of mead in the context of a competition. Okay, the basics of evaluation are still present, so we'll do everything we did in the previous section of the mead evaluation part. But perceptions are recorded in a structured manner and on a score sheet, along with feedback to the mead maker. We also assign numerical scores to identify the relative rankings, and these will determine the awards. And always remember that entrants pay for this feedback and scoring, so it is your duty to give the judging your best effort. So getting ready for a flight. So the day before, you should make yourself familiar with the styles that you're going to have in the competition. Usually, you know which flight that you're going to judge before you come, and you can make yourself acquainted with the styles, and also discuss the characteristics you will be looking for with the other judges at the table, and like having a table calibration. Go over the list of meads to be judged in your flight, along with any specific modifiers, variety of honey, the strength, the sweetness, and carbonation level for each mead, and decide on the order you wish to judge the meads. Usually we start from the less sweet to the sweeter meads, and then as a secondary ordering, we use the alcohol strength. If we need a third, then the carbonation level. Discuss the judging order with your steward, and as well as the serving temperature. Sometimes the meads can be too cold, and it's beneficial to ask the steward to get them out before he should give them to you from the cooler. And ask if the meads have quart bottles. And if they do, make sure that you have a corkscrew to open these. Finally, take note of the number of meads you're going to judge in the flight. If there is a large number, remember to take smaller sips. Meads are usually higher in alcohol than beers, and you can become very intoxicated very quickly. So take smaller sips in meads. Then after you got ready, you can start judging. So judging a single entry, how does it look in the mead? So the first thing we do is fill the score sheet's headers, including the information about the mead and about yourself. Then, if it's possible, do a bottle inspection before serving each mead, looking for the fill level, bacterial rings, and sediment level. Green or clear bottles are fine in a mead because skunkiness shouldn't be a problem unless it's a hopped braggot. You don't have any isoalpha acids to break. Open the mead and pour 1 to 3 ounces of the mead. Decant off slowly so that any sediment is left behind. Then after pouring the sample, quickly inhale the aromas. Use long, deep sniffs or short, shallow sniffs. The latter are preferable, but whatever works best for you, as long as you're consistent for all the meads that you're going to judge. Write down your initial impression of the aroma and the bouquet. Use the methods that we talked about in describing the mead aromatics, and then try to be as specific as you can, and also add quantities. Always use quantities for each descriptor. Move on to the appearance of the mead, and then smell the mead again and take a slow sip, and note if any of the aroma changed, okay, in the score sheet. Assess the mouthfeel. Assess the mouthfeel of the mead and the flavor, okay, when you're sipping, and then consider the factors that we talked about in discussing when we described the assessing the mead mouthfeel. And then in the overall impression section, give a general impression of the mead. So give an objective comment on how the mead fits the intended style, and if flaws were not noted, point to any possible causes and offer advice for how to fix them. We will discuss this section in the next meeting. So there are several important things to keep in mind when you're judging. So always avoid negative comments. And most of the time, negative comment will close the comments receptor from accepting your comments as objective comments, and it doesn't help anyone. Emphasize the mead's positive attributes, even if it's awful, and try not to be too specific, since you don't know how the mead was made. So don't make any assumptions. Make sure to check any checkboxes describing the mead, and identifying off flavors, or simply describing your view of how the mead is good in stylistic, technical, and the intangible merits of this mead. Note that an experienced mead judge should be able to completely perform and a written overall evaluation in about 10 minutes. And it takes a lot of practice to get to these times. And it's like anything with judging. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. Finally, the most important thing is that a good mead evaluation should provide a thorough sensory evaluation. And again, keep in mind, you don't know all of the processes that the mead maker did. So at best, you're making an educated guesses when you offer advice. So try not to make any assumptions when you're making advice. That's for judging a single entry. Another thing about preparing score sheets at competitions. So judges usually have two main decision strategies. Judges usually either do a top-down approach when you decide, the top-down approach is when you decide the total score of the mead, and then you break it up to the categories, and the bottom-up approach when you give scores for each category, add them up, and give the overall score of the mead. The problem with the top-down approach that you can easily have, you can easily downscore a category with this approach, and the bottom-up approach can easily get to overscoring of the mead. So always use a combination of the two. Start by the bottom-up. And see where your overall score fits in the scoring guide on the left-hand side of the scoring sheet. See where it fits, and then fix your scores to make it fit in the right range in the scoring guide. This is about the decision strategies. Then for scoring calibration, so the minimal score for each mead in the BJCP, like in beer, the minimum courtesy score is 13. In an exam, I wouldn't give less than 16 because you're at the master range with plus minus 3 points. So even if the proctors gave 13 with 16, you're still covered, but with 16, you're covered between 13 to 19. So obviously, chances wise, 16 to 40 in an exam. Clearly out of style mead is capped at 30 points, okay? Even if it's like the best melomel you've ever tasted, and it was served as a traditional mead, you cannot give it more than 30, okay? A clearly out of style mead that does not have any faults bottoms at 20, okay? So let's establish that the range for a clearly out of style mead is 20 to 30 points. A mead with a single bad fault is capped at 25. So if you have a mead with bad diacetyl, bad alcohol warmth and stuff like that, the most you can give it is 25 points. And a mead with a bad infection, like I don't know, like Zimmermanus with diacetyl and a lot of acidity is capped at 20 points, no more. Usually new and unexperienced judges tend to give very high scores. And so this is like a scoring calibration for meads. Also, after all of the judges in your table finish their scoring, you should reach a consensus scores. Most organizers will ask the judges to be within 7 points. However, 3 points is the ideal target. Having great variance between the average can create a lot of frustration for the entrants. I must say that in the last competition, we tried 5 point target of differences between the minimum and maximum scores, and it worked out perfectly. So try to come to a common agreement about the mead. That's for scoring reconciliation. after we judge the mead. And lastly, some thoughts about mead judging. So first thing to discuss is bias. Most people prefer sweet meads to dry meads, carbonated to still, and sack to hydromel. So try to see if you have such bias and try to avoid it when you're evaluating meads at competitions. For quantitative levels, so if someone declared that it's sweet mead, but you think that it's a dry mead, so you can deduct up to 3 points for 2 levels off, and up to 1 point for 1 level off. So if they said it's a sweet mead, and in fact it's a semi-sweet mead, okay, so -1 point. Discuss drinkability. Always discuss drinkability. The main thing to ensure that the mead is capable of high scores, it should be drinkable. If it's unpleasant, you don't want to finish the sample, it shouldn't get a high score. Always ensure that it's drinkable. Drinkability is the most important thing in any beverage. Then honey varietals. Each honey varietal should reflect its monofloral description. So remember that this should be the main flavor. So in the traditional meats, yeah. So other traits, but other traits may be present. So if the mead maker said that it's a citrus mead, then you should smell it's a citrus flower mead. I'm sorry, you should smell citrusy notes in the mead. Adjuncts, be sure you understand the adjuncts that were used and how they should affect the mead. So if they added, I don't know, like brown sugar or malts, ciders, fruits, and other things, be sure you understand them and how they should affect the mead. And the balance, sweetness, acidity, and tannin are the main balance factors between sweetness and acidity and tannin. So it will affect the mead mouthfeel, okay? So remember to always note these 3 things in any mead you evaluate. Otherwise, it wouldn't be complete. Yeah, that's it.